Okay, so episode 6? No, episode 5. Great start. So last week's episode was testing. Do you have any follow-up you'd like to make about that?
That it was a bit of a beast
Yeah.
on the re-listen, but
Yeah.
it is a complex topic. And also how hard Marjorie's Law was to write. Really difficult.
Definitely.
Way more difficult than I thought. And the more I thought about it, the only thing I could formalise at all was the parameters to deciding.
Yeah.
And then I just know what to do with them and whether I should write tests. So like, how long will it take me to write the tests? How likely are we to change the code? Things like that.
Yeah.
Who will shout at me? Will I be disappointed in myself? Will someone die? Those kind of things. But I just know what to do with them, but I can't. I think it's because those things don't have units. Maybe it's probabilities most of the time, but
Yeah, that's the one that we linked to in the end. I did unitize all of them. That's not a word, but
unitize.
Because that's what the problem I was having with it. I tried to write it out as a formula, and I was like, but you can't add these things together because the units don't line up.
No.
So then I standardized them all to have units that you could do that with. So it was basically man hours per feature.
Yes.
Or cost, i.e. monetary value.
Yeah, it makes it obvious how uncertain software development is.
Yeah.
But we'll include it in the show notes of this show and the last show if you want to have a look.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I think it puts down the things to think about. The actual equation, like you say, the equations themselves perhaps are less useful, but if you want to see it in a mathematical way, I guess.
Sort of common sense, or maybe just sense, maybe not common sense, I don't know. But you kind of just know what to do because you think, oh, someone will get mad, or I don't know, but it's hard.
I think like we said, right, if you've listened to the episode, there's a lot of back and forth on everything, right? Like it's very hard to say concretely this is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was one of my main things on the re-listen was, were we not pro-test enough in big organizations? I think, and the other thing that I thought about that I realized when I was thinking about if you work in a big organization and we were discussing how you probably should do testing, why do big organizations not do that, and how could they? Because quite a lot of them don't, and especially like we said during the 90s and the noughties, maybe they didn't. And I think the only answer I really have that's concrete is kind of a cultural change from the top of a company. So they hire someone who is like, this is the best way of doing it, and they make them CTO or something. And then they kind of just sort of say, then you have a culture in the team, and you have which I think is where a lot of is it dogma? Is that the right word? But a lot of like these strong things that we were condemning, I think that's where it comes from. People that have worked in those kind of teams where they need a really strong sense of, we don't deliver features without tests, because otherwise the business just make them deliver loads of stuff, and then they end up with like this, loads of debt, and it's bad for the business in like the medium to long term. So perhaps that's why there are people that are just kind of so prescriptive.
It's that interface to the business, I think, right? If that, how those people describe testing to the business, then impacts the business's feeling on tests, and then that comes back round to when they are being unreasonable about delivering features, right?
Yeah, I was thinking it's really a test is kind of like a feature, but it's almost second order. So it's not like a first order feature is like someone says, can you make that button red? And the test is verifying that button's red if you should test that. But it's so the user or the customer doesn't really see it. But it is a feature. It's almost a feature for the team that are building the thing, because it gives you properties of. It kind of will define how quickly you can build things in the future and how likely things are to break. And those are things that those customers will care about as well.
Just not
directly. And they will care in the future. I mean, I've been in a lot of teams where they're like, why the hell does it take 6 weeks to build this thing? And the answer was because for the last 3 years, we've, not done testing and other things.
Yeah.
Now we're paying for it. So I think
you've got to pay it at some point. It's whether you pay it up front with tests or later with slow change, I guess.
Yeah. But it's basically the trade-off, isn't it? If you build big things. I think that some of this microservices stuff is like another way of kind of getting around that. I was thinking about that as well, and how it's turned out that everybody's ended up building HTTP APIs and WebSockets for real time and JSON usually, although sometimes things like protobuf and other formats. But that's become almost a standard interface for like 2 bits of code talking to one another. And obviously you can decouple things quite nicely. And if you have like a HTTP RESTful API and then you say, oh, we want to rebuild this component, the interface for it is very well defined in HTTP and all of that stuff. You can maybe, like when we were talking about scaling a startup and how you definitely shouldn't write tests at the beginning and then you need to. If you've broken it into lots of API calls, you'll probably actually stand a slightly better chance because you can pick them off in groups or one at a time.
If each URL is like a different microservice, you could rewrite them with tests.
Yeah.
Easier, right? Rather than the monolith of having to rewrite the whole thing in one go.
Yeah, or even if you had a monolith of like 20 APIs, you can probably migrate 1 or 2.
I was thinking you might be like, well, we'll do it in a different technology now or something.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
So having those separate pieces, right, you can...
Whereas if you just have code, which was kind of the way before, then it's harder. But I was sort of thinking some of these things do help. Hard problem though.
Yeah.
Really hard.
Definitely hard. And there is definitely a justification for not writing them. It's an easy way out that you have to be aware, I guess, of what the risks you're taking by not writing tests. They're definitely justifiable in a lot of cases. You just have to be happy with that risk.
Yeah. I encourage everybody to learn how to do it and then choose not to, like we do.
Yeah.
If that's the right decision. But I think
one thing I didn't ask you, actually, and I did want to ask you, I mentioned what I use when I'm in Java. What testing library do you use in JavaScript?
There are a few decent ones, and I am a Mocha Chai person. So Mocha is like the test runner thing, and Chai is like it's a like Hamcrest in Java. So it lets you say 2b equals and things like that.
Yeah.
And they're both
interesting names.
Yeah, there's like Chai supports 3 different ways of naming things. So you can have like should, expect, and they're like 3 completely different ways of naming. But they're both really good libraries. And do
they come together? Do you use both together?
Yeah, they're very. You can. I don't know if you can use Chai without Mocha. I think you can. I think they're very commonly used together because Chai is just about asserting things, and so you can assert things in any. So I'd imagine actually you can use it with like jest and other things.
And then something else, the Mocha bit is just picking up those assertions and reporting the results.
Because of the ecosystem of JavaScript there's a lot of test frameworks, a lot of them were rubbish, some of them were good, and now we're in a pretty good place. And give me the stuff over JUnit any day, I'd say. But whilst we're on the topic of testing, there's something else which isn't really to do with whether you should write tests or not, but I'm a really big fan of something called, in JUnit it's called parameterized tests. It's a feature of JUnit,
right?
Which is basically not talking about JUnit anymore, but you write a bunch of test cases, which might be some sort of just pure structure. So you might have an array of like inputs and then the expected outputs. So you'll have like an array and it will say the input is 1, 2, 3, and you're testing your average function, so the expected output is 2, and then the next item in your array would be like the inputs are going to be, an array of 1, and the expected output is 1, and then you can run the same test over and over again on those inputs and expected outputs.
Okay.
And I'm a really big fan of that. So you might have.
I've actually never used that feature in JUnit.
It's a specific feature in JUnit, but in Mocha Chai you can just write a for loop around a test. Basically, so you write a loop. You literally say, "Here are my 10 different cases I care about." It's really well for pure functional things. But you say, "Here are the inputs. Here are the expected outputs." You could have like 100 of them, and then it will just loop over the same test, which goes, "I'm going to call the function with the inputs and check that it equals the expected outputs." Yeah. So you just write one test basically, but then you run it 100 times with 100 different parameters.
That's good.
And then you might have the same thing for exception cases. So you might just have a test which is like, I expect an exception to be thrown, and then the array is like, if you pass in null, or if you just have like null because that's an invalid input, not a number because that's an invalid input, and then you might have 10 cases for that. Yeah. So a lot of functions when you're doing them, you might end up writing sort of 3 tests, but you might throw multiple parameters through each of them.
That's pretty good.
It's basically dry, do not repeat yourself.
Yeah.
It's basically just a kind of refactor rather than writing 30 tests which have basically the same code, but they have different inputs. You just write one and then you just chuck loads of different things into them.
Yeah, I should check that out because I feel like a lot of tests I write are like that. So.
Yeah, it's a really cool concept, and it's JUnit is called parameterized tests, and it has it as an explicit feature, but a lot of test frameworks don't. But in dynamic languages, you just loop over the inputs and the expected outputs and write the test in the middle of the loop, and then it will just call the test like 30 times or something. Because another thing about tests, which I think is really important, there's a lot of this should and expect stuff. And I think as long as when they print to the console, they look nice, I'm happy. That's kind of if one of them breaks, I want to know which one. I want to have a good indication of roughly what went wrong. I want them to be grouped by functionality and indented. Do you know what I mean? So I'm testing this function and then all the tests are indented in there. And maybe you indent twice if that's appropriate. But yeah, I think Mocha Chai lets you change, if you're parameterizing the test, it lets you can change the test name. So you could say, for this input, I would expect, you can write that in your test. And then the tests will look nice when they're printed out as well. Yeah. I think JUnit has the same thing.
I don't think I've ever run JUnit on the console. It's just built into Eclipse. So.
Oh, yeah.
So you just get a window with
you still get all the names.
Tree and stuff.
Yeah.
The name's just the method name, right?
So those are my 2 pro tips for testing. I don't have any more. That's it. I'm out.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think the Chai piece with and the equivalent in Hamcrest is nice because it makes the tests a lot more readable. I think using those matches makes tests that you can actually reason about.
I think the whole matcher thing is actually one of the... You were saying in the last episode about how I think you sort of alluded to it. You were kind of saying if you haven't written tests often, it can be quite slow when you start.
Yeah.
And I took that to mean Hamcrest specifically because the API, it's true with all of these sorts of things. So it's basically a thing which lets you say should be equal to or something in quite a English kind of way.
Yeah, it allows you to write an English sentence with functions.
Yeah.
In Java specifically.
So it would be like...
So you can do like assert that is the name of the function. It takes 2 arguments.
Yeah.
First one is the thing you want to execute. The right-hand side is then what you're expecting out. And you can say... And then it has a function called is, a function called equal to, which you put inside the is. So you end up reading it like an English, like a sentence.
So it'll be like dot is dot equals to, or like... Yeah, and you get all, and there's all different ones for like asserting about dates and
does a hash map have a key?
Yes,
all those sort of ones.
So it'll be like dot has key, and all these different ones. But they're great because when you're done, you end up with this beautiful English-looking sentence.
Yeah,
and they're rubbish because remembering the API if you don't do them every week is nearly impossible because it's basically a sentence.
Does it have? Yeah, it's like what's the has key one? Because I don't think it is necessarily has key. And then you've got to import static everything so you get it looking nice in Java anyway.
Oh, yeah.
So if you import everything as static, then you can actually write it without any dot notation or matches dot.
Yeah.
So then it looks really good.
Yeah.
But you've got to import static.
We can include an example of a beautiful Hamcrest.
I think that the one actually from last week, I think, has some in that I linked from my those open source site. We can link it again.
We'll relink it.
Okay, let's stop talking about tests, I think.
Yeah, that's enough on tests.
Because otherwise it's another episode of testing.
No one wants that.
So, what are we going to talk about this week, Rich?
Cloud stuff.
Cloud stuff. Well put.
Cloud stuff, but cloud is I don't like the term cloud. I don't know about you, but I'm not. I think it's too broad and people have misused it a lot.
Is there a better word?
No.
Services?
There's a lot of work. We could have a whole episode on things that are misnamed.
Yeah.
AI, DevOps, ML, that's blockchain, all these buzzwords. Yeah. But what I mean is, so when I say cloud, I mean software which is running on other people's servers, which is available usually on the open internet. So you could just go on any internet connection and get them. So that's things like AWS or Azure, so like cloud hosting stuff.
Yeah.
But also things like even maybe Google Docs, Dropbox, Google Drive, and then more programmery focused things. So kind of APIs like Stripe, Airtable, which is a UI, but it has really good APIs as well.
So traditionally, there are three categories, right? There's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service.
Yes.
There's probably other AASs.
All the as a services, basically. Maybe that's a better name. As a service.
As a service,
basically everything as a service. And so this has pretty much been, I would say, maybe you'll disagree with me, the biggest change since we graduated and became pro is that these things they were kind of just getting started / they were just sort of in the early stages, and now they're ridiculously dominant. And AWS is a big part, big multi-billion dollar business, I think. And
so big they're thinking about spinning it out of Amazon to be a separate company.
Which is fair because it's ridiculously.
It's interesting if you think back to 2010, 2009 maybe. Yeah, I think you're right. It's nearly 10 years ago, right? And it's amazing how now you wouldn't. I think considering running stuff on your own hardware in your own house or data center, particularly if you're a new company, it would be a non-start. It's so low down your list. There's so many other ways of solving that problem now that didn't used to exist.
It would be a red flag. And so the plus side of this is that some clever people or small groups of people in certain businesses have solved some difficult problems, and the rest of us just get to use all their hard work, and it saves hopefully a lot of time, and you end up with software which is better because they can. It's kind of like economies of scale or division of labor, I suppose. They build AWS once rather than 30 different or a million different organizations running their hardware in their own ways. And for someone I know was running an email server a few years ago on sort of on a cloud platform, but their server was actually physically running. So it was in the cloud, but it wasn't managed. So it wasn't like Google Mail.
It was a physical server.
Yeah, it was like a server with ports, and it was running. And their email was going down all the time. And we switched it over to Google, whatever it's called now, Google for Business. It's called. But the thing I mean, that Gmail for Business, and obviously that has like an SLA of being up 99.9% of the time. And guess what? There's been no problems since we switched. So it's kind of twofold. It's like a productivity gain, and then it's also the end product can be better, especially in terms of downtime and things messing up. I mean, obviously there have been some AWS has had some outages in the last few years and has brought down half the internet with it.
Yeah.
But by and large, I think the uptime of most of that stuff has been better. And so the thing I wanted to talk about was whether, given that big transition and that this stuff is available, there are jobs where you can't use all of those things, or you can use a subset of those things. I think bigger companies are really starting to embrace, what was it called, infrastructure as a service. Yeah. So I'm hearing of a lot of financial institutions in London. If you're a non-UK listener, London is mainly, in my opinion, a financial services town, which uses a lot of software, but those organizations aren't like tech first. So it's not really like Silicon Valley in that way, which is like got a lot of tech first. Because Silicon Valley companies will always use the cloud.
Yeah.
You don't hear of a new startup, or even like Netflix are using AWS, and they're a really big business.
Yeah.
But if you go to a big bank in London, what percentage of the cloud are they using? But I think even those guys are starting to use AWS now.
Yeah, so I know a lot of investment banks here are looking at hybrid. They're called hybrid solutions, whereby you connect your existing data centers that you own or rent space out of to Amazon or Azure, and then it's one holistic network, but some of it is being run on other people's infrastructure and some of it's being run on yours.
Yeah, because I guess there are regulatory and other risks of leaking data. And
I actually think the biggest, I mean, I know we're going to talk a lot about it, but one of the things to consider, and things that I hadn't considered until we started using it at my current place, AWS, the cost model is quite difficult at scale. Like, I don't really understand how Netflix can use AWS
and not be bankrupt.
Yeah, because the pay-as-you-go costs, the monthly costs means that, it doesn't scale up that well. Because at some point, right, this is just an example, but if you have a rack in a data center, That's going to cost you an amount a month, and that's a monthly cost.
It's very transparent. You know what you're getting.
Well, yeah, but that's a monthly cost. You can't get away from that. The problem comes from when you want to buy hardware. Because if you buy a server, you spend 20 grand on a server, you then own that server for as long as you want it.
Yeah.
If you want it for a year and then upgrade it, yeah, that's probably not great value because, divide it by monthly cost, it's going to be more than Amazon. But if you decide to keep it for 5 or 6 years, because it's like, I don't know, something you're not that bothered about, or, it's not critical if it reboots every now and again, then looking at it from a management budgetary point of view, the benefit case isn't quite there. Because, yeah, you save data center networking costs, but if you already have some physical hardware or some physical data center space, justifying the move to the cloud isn't as clear cut. But there are then benefits where you can say, well, actually, we can for workloads that burst up and down. The cloud makes a lot of sense, right? Because you're not saying, well, we'll buy these 10 servers, but actually we only need 10 once a week, and the rest of the time we need one.
Yeah,
that's perfectly cloud. I mean, that's a great cloud migration strategy. But if you've got a piece of software that runs 24/7 on a 16-core box that needs 64 gigabytes of RAM, i.e. maybe a database, for example, you might be like, well, we could just buy 2 of those servers, run them in parallel as a sort of cluster. And that's a fixed cost then for the next 5 years. Yeah. Versus, well, it's, we'll pick a particular Amazon instance, but that might not be big enough. We might have to scale it up. You probably aren't going to scale it down. And I just think it's something that I'm a big proponent of cloud services, as we'll get onto. But it's interesting in where I am now when we were looking at it from a monetary point of view. It's not a clear cut, particularly for server resources like that. Now, when you move to platform as a service like Amazon RDS, which is their database offering,
just get a database.
You don't. I mean, there are other benefits there that are not just the cost, right? Because you're getting things like there's no server anymore that you need to manage. You're just getting an instance, and it has an endpoint, and you can just connect to it, and those benefits are worth it. But again, that's under the assumption that you've got quite a small company. Because if you're in a big company, you're going to have database engineers, you're going to have infrastructure engineers. Yeah. And then it's like, what? I mean, those guys will end up just managing Amazon for
you. Can fire them all.
Well, yeah. But I don't think you can, because I think at scale, I think you still have complexities in the cloud.
Yeah. You won't be surprised to hear me say that if you fired all your database engineers, I'd be very happy. But,
well, we don't have any.
Yeah, excellent. I don't like databases, for the record. They're not. I know they're a necessary evil, but data is always so hard and pesky. But yeah, I do know what you mean. Actually, it's the pricing of AWS. Everyone always says, business people always say, "Oh, it saves us so much money and it's so cheap." Yet whenever I look at it for like personal projects at home, I mean, maybe from a business perspective, it's different. But I always think, gosh, like you said, a 16-core server with 64 gig of RAM, that's going to cost you on AWS. And the other thing is with their billing.
It's opaque as well.
Their billing is opaque as hell. And I once fiddled around with AWS for like a personal project. They billed me $1.99 for about 2 years because I couldn't figure I couldn't figure what had turned on or where to turn it off. When my credit card expired, that was the only time that basically that got turned off, and that account got locked and banned. And I was like, "That's fine. They're not taking my money anymore." But it does seem
it's because it's not. I guess you're moving from a. It's difficult. There's a lot of reasons for it, and one of the differences between if you're running inside an organization with infrastructure versus on Amazon, things that you get if you have an internal network that you're running yourself, things that you don't get charged for, right, are networking. And storage to some degree, because generally, if you're buying a server, you're going to buy some hard drives in it, and you're going to then just have that storage. Whereas obviously Amazon, if you store a terabyte, there's no fixed cost on that. You're going to be storing that terabyte and paying per month for as long as you want to store it. Whereas if you buy a 1 terabyte hard drive, you pay £60 for it. Then you've got that £60. It's a sunk cost, and you just as long you could keep that for as long as that disk.
It's almost like renting a car versus buying a car, isn't it?
But then networking, you generally assume is free internally, right? Because you're like in your house, you're like, to get the data from my internet, so my router to my PC. Yeah, I'm not paying for that. But in Amazon's world, assuming you're not running everything entirely in Amazon, which I think is pretty much impossible, but not. I mean, you could go all in on Amazon. Then there are going to be outbound charges that are going to cost you. And, if it's an internet website, then everybody accessing your website is costing you money.
Yeah, that's something that's going to be... I mean, I've not really been involved with any of these sorts of things, but I can imagine the predictability of what the bill's going to be in one model is very predictable, and then the other model totally isn't predictable. I mean, maybe you've got some stuff where you're thinking, I'm going to buy a server for 5 years. But I guess also, if your requirements don't change, so you need a 16-core server with 64 gigs of RAM, in 5 years, if you're paying Amazon monthly, the price of that should have decreased because the same compute will get cheaper. Whereas if you buy it, you'll have a server which is knackered and need a new one. Whereas with Amazon, they'll just be migrating you to or you can get better servers. And
and obviously you've got to run, the cost of running these servers isn't cheap. You've got to factor that in as well, and cooling.
It's going to be like the total cost of
ownership. That's the comparison.
And the staff must be quite a big component of that. And you must need, I'd imagine, you still, like you say, you're going to need some people to look after this stuff, but probably a few people can look after a lot of stuff, because you're not dealing in the physical world anymure, just dealing in consoles and APIs and things. But
then I guess it depends to what level you're abstracting away, right? Like if you're doing infrastructure as a service, that's obviously the lowest level.
Yes.
And that therefore you've got all the problems you have physically. It's just that you're not managing the physical hardware. You've still got to deal with networking, routing, and all that kind of stuff, provisioning servers.
Yeah. It's like rather than crawling under a table in a data center, you just click some buttons, but you still got to do it.
But you've still got to go, we now need to route from place A to place B. And that's not, any decent sized organization, that's not going to be as simple as it is. But then it's the next level up, right? And then it's like, maybe we look at platform as a service.
Yeah.
Which I think Amazon RDS would be a platform as a service.
Well, that's interesting. So I would have said that, where does Heroku sit on this for you? For those of you that don't know, RDS is a database where you just say, give me a database, and you can just check a box and say, I want to enable backups, and you get loads of cool stuff, and you can fire your DBA and be very happy about it. And sorry, DBAs. Heroku is a completely different thing, which is for deploying code, which is kind of like you give it your project of code. So if you've got a Node project or a Java project, you say, here's all the code, and it understands that. There's a config file as well, builds it and runs it as long as it exposes a HTTP port. There's also workers, but don't need to worry about that. So it's not like they give you a server. They probably run it on AWS, but you never see any of the infrastructure at all. And then it can do things like load balancing. So you can say, I want 5 of these, but you still have one URL, and it goes to one of the 5 round robin or something, so that none of them crumble. But I know what you mean, though. RDS is kind of...
You're abstracting... So I don't know what... I would say they are different, but I don't think there's a different term for those two things.
No, probably not in this industry. But I know what you mean. There's a lot of...
Maybe RDS actually would be a software as a service, because you're saying I want a database of this type.
Yeah.
And it's giving you just that. Whereas what Heroku's giving you is layers of technologies on top of each other that you're not seeing, right?
Yeah.
So you're getting your VM... You're getting a load balancer, you're getting deployment, and all of those things together. And that's more like Amazon's Elastic Beanstalk, where you're getting a front to back solution, and you're basically just deploying the code with some config.
One big problem with AWS is the names for everything are absolutely ridiculous. And something we can link to for you is on Hacker News, somebody has made a cheat sheet of all the names and what they mean in real life, which is immense. So we will link to that, and you can know what Elastic...
As I've already used 2 of them, then people might already be scratching their heads.
Yeah, just going, they're all absolutely crazy. But AWS tends to be... They've also got Lambdas, which has been quite a big... I don't know if innovation's the right word, but it's quite a cool new thing. So a Lambda's where you give it some code. Normally, I think it's going to be exposed over HTTP. So it's like a web service or something. You say, here's the code that I want to run when they hit my HTTP service. And it can scale very effectively to 0. So if no one's using it, it's just not there. But it can start up really quick. And you only pay for the seconds of compute time you use when the Lambdas are running. So if no one hits it, you pay nothing. If 1 million people hit it, it can easily scale to that, and it scales dynamically. You don't need to go in and press a button. They will just launch as many as are needed of your service. So AWS has some quite low-level components and then some sort of medium ones and then some quite high-level ones.
So, that's what makes AWS complicated, right? Is it's got all three of those things.
Multi-level.
And not split up in any sort of useful way. The Lambdas thing is interesting, though. I think it's really cool. But what you find is if you use Lambdas, is that thing on its own isn't going to give you what you want.
Yeah.
Because you've got to then link it to an Amazon application gateway and then blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of moving pieces.
Yeah.
And that's where AWS gets overly complicated. And I think that's where, when I said before about where you're going to still need some guys to manage it, is because you have those complexities. Now, they have a couple of products to help abstract that away again, Elastic Beanstalk, and they have OpsWorks, which is like a programmatic definition of an application, and it just builds all the other complicated pieces for you. But if you're a startup, is it too complicated? And the answer for me is yes.
Yes, agreed. Yeah, the domains that I work in, I do not touch AWS, and you can probably hear from the stuff I'm saying, I'm not that experienced with it. And really, I think everything we're saying pretty much applies to Azure and Google Cloud, which are...
Apparently Google Cloud is easier. I haven't used that one, but you haven't used AWS and Azure. So AWS I used at the last place, and we use it a bit at the current place, and Azure a little bit at the previous place. They all have problems, and the problems are with complexity or lack of customization.
Yeah, AWS just isn't very... It's the kind of thing where you feel like you might get a certification for it. It's that complicated. You can.
Yeah,
excellent.
Yeah.
So I'm very excited about the level up from that. That's kind of my thing. So most of the stuff that...
So we're thinking more like Heroku. So we're going to call that... We'll call that platform as a service.
I think that is the technical... I don't know, who cares? But so that is like you give it some code and it runs. And so Heroku's quite old. It got acquired by Salesforce. I don't know how old it is. Maybe 10 years.
It was the first one of those, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was the one that popularized it. And did a lot of stuff right and did not make as much money as you would think, actually.
Their costs were... They charged nowhere near enough for that product, right? It was really cheap.
It's kind of cheap, but kind of expensive, because what would happen is when you were a startup, it was quite cheap, like 15 quid a month, or 15 pounds a month, sorry. And you'd think, this is pretty cheap. And then you'd get bigger, I guess, as a company. And then all of a sudden your bill's like £1,000. And then you'd be thinking, if we were on AWS, we could be paying like £100. And then at that point you've got the scale and you've got the engineers to move over. And you want to start doing more complicated things with data centers and regions and security. So you hire some dedicated DevOps guys, and the first thing they're going to say is, let's get off this Heroku. So it's kind of... But there's a new kid on the block, which I'm a really big caveated fan of, which is called Now, or Now.sh, which is a really stupid name for a product because of the SEO. When you Google Now, you're not going to find the product Now. Yeah. And when you try and talk about Now, it sounds like you're saying Now, which makes every conversation you have about Now ridiculous, as you're about to find out. So it's called...
So the official name of the product is Now?
It's Now. It's by a company called Zeit, Z-E-I-T, which is really, if you just Google Zeit, you'll find them. And they're kind of like a Silicon Valley upstart, and they have basically built something which is similar to Heroku, but more modern. And it's pretty much all command line driven, as Heroku originally was. There isn't much in the way of websites, which I think is probably a good thing for programmers. And that's really cool. And they've just released V2 of their platform, which the caveat is that I hope they don't listen to this and get mad with me. So they're a team of 7 programmers who seem awesome, and they build the APIs of everything they build. I think, wow, why didn't I think of that? That's incredible, and it's going to change the world. Then you try and use it in production, and before you know it, you're back on Heroku or AWS because it just doesn't quite work. And I've emailed them a few times talking to them about robustness. And as you know, you compared to me, you're the robustness guy, and I'm the throw caution to the wind. Well, it will probably work, and I'm not that fussed about uptime and SLAs and agreements, but you need to be able to deploy your code, and then it needs to run all the time. I would never use any of these products for a client,
right?
Because I don't want to say to my client like, "Oh, it's just not working," and I don't know why, and I think there's a high probability. But all of those things can be fixed, and they're just focusing on iterating their product. And then they've just released a new version, which arguably was not what they needed, and it's very Lambda focused, and it's really awesome. And you can deploy code really quickly. And I think behind the scenes it uses all AWS stuff. And the new version, you can plug in different clouds apparently, so you can say I want to use Google Cloud or Azure behind the scenes, and it will you get the same kind of API for the developer, but it's really high level. It's like one config file. Here's a folder full of stuff. You can buy domain names on their thing on the command line. You can buy a domain name on the command line and it's automatically attached and stuff. It's really like...
So what's their USP compared to Heroku then? What are they trying to do differently?
It's similar. I'm trying to think what is different. So one thing that's quite different is that each deployment you do, so you run a command to deploy your code and it goes away and it builds it and then it comes back and it gives you a unique URL with a hash in the URL. And every deploy you do is immutable and has a unique URL. And then they have a concept of aliasing, which is where your main URL that you give your customers or your users switches between these kind of hashed URLs.
Yeah.
And so that means when you roll back, it's trivial because you've got two versions running and you just switch the alias. Yeah, it's just like a CNAME change, but you just run this command and say, actually, I want to go back to this one. And it just works. That's quite cool. I mean, Heroku may do that behind the scenes, but they've just made it a bit more explicit. They also, there's little things like they use the tech is like, everything is like HTTP2, and it's just, when it is working, it is blazing fast. Like I've never had a problem with it being, like the response times you can get on it are amazing. It works really well with Node as well. And it also runs Docker containers. It's really cool. It's like one of those things that like, if I went to work for a big company and I couldn't use it anymore, I'd kind of, well, to be fair, I don't use it with clients, but once it's done, it's one of those things that you think, what they really need to do is make a self-hosted version that can be hosted on-premise, because it's the kind of tool that as a programmer in a big company, in my first job, it would have been immense if somehow they could have hooked it into their own infrastructure.
I was thinking that. Yeah.
Or a private,
private cloud,
like firewalled off from the rest of the world. So it's an AWS, but the rest of the world can't get in. It would be amazing. But so it's just really cool. I've not done it justice on why it's better than Heroku. It's just more modern, and the API is really, the new API is a clear cut above Heroku. So you have a config file. So you build, I don't want to plug them too much, but I've used it once and it didn't work. Sorry guys, but it just didn't build my project, which my project's built with one of their libraries, because these are the same guys that made that terminal, which we discussed in the first episode, the Hyper terminal, which is the terminal which just looks amazing.
These guys have done that as well.
Yeah, they've got a focus on like UX, which is really strange for an infrastructure company.
Yeah.
But the reason they have Hyper is that when they build new stuff of their platform as a service now, they demo it in Hyper so it looks sweet.
Yeah.
So they've built a whole terminal just for like marketing, and demos, but worth it. But yeah, the new version, you can have a monolith repo with, say, some Node code and some Go code and some static HTML. And then in your file, you say, look, this folder is a Node project. Say you've got 10 JavaScript files with 10 different endpoints in. You can say, all of these I want to be lambdas. Each file, and you can use like a glob. So you can say star.js, they're a lambda. And this Go thing, those 4 Go files, they're 4 lambdas. And my static stuff, I want to be on a HTML, like a CDN.
Yeah.
And then it will create 10 JavaScript lambdas, 4 Go lambdas, and host all the HTML on like an Edge CDN, which is in like 150 countries. And it's just, that's a next level. And like, it doesn't really, I would say it's in beta. They don't use the phrase beta. It's in beta or alpha. It's not really ready for prime time. But the concept, you're like, is amazing. Because to orchestrate that all yourself in AWS and have it so that you can run a command. I think the Heroku interface, though, of just you run a command, it takes your code from version control, builds it and deploys it, is a thing that almost all projects should use. But I think a lot of projects can't use in the real world because your company might not want to use Heroku. You might want to use...
Yeah. So
I think if whoever builds a tool that lets you maybe use a lot of the sort of like VPN, sort of all the things they might want to do, but in a tool like this, it'll be amazing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one of the big ones for me.
Interestingly, I think we should talk another time about monolithic repos, right?
Yeah,
it's an interesting one where it's a bit up in the air at the moment, I think.
Yeah.
Which is the right way
to go. The big boys will do it. and Facebook does, Google does.
Yeah. But anyway, that's just.
But yeah, another time.
So what language does it support? Anything then?
It supports Docker, so more or less, yeah.
You can run anything in. So anything you can Dockerize, you can deploy it as a.
The new thing has the concept of a builder, and you can write your own builder. And I think the base technology is Docker, so I think you can. It supports a bunch of things that people and they themselves have already written builders for, but it can be extended. So someone apparently wrote a builder for OCaml. I was listening to a podcast the other day with the founder. So you can now run OCaml in this thing. So I'm guessing that's anything. If OCaml goes, then anything goes. But yeah, it's pretty cool. But I mean, Heroku's also just like that's like a thing. And I think the main thing I've realized as my career has progressed, these kinds of tools, if I can't have them, then I'm kind of like, because the reason I got in this game, we discussed it a bit in the last episode, but I like building things that people want. I don't want to build something, and I don't think all programmers are like this. Some people like building things for the sake of building things because it's a mentally stimulating intellectual challenge. And that is a valid thing. Like, people do puzzles, people do math competitions.
Yeah.
They love it. But I like doing things that I feel are important because that's what I get a kick out of. Maybe they're not important to the whole world, but they're important to some people somewhere.
Yeah.
And they're going to care. And I feel like not having these tools that are mainly in the cloud hinders the ability to get stuff done. You just know that you could do it quicker. That's the problem.
I guess you're thinking, though, if you're on your own, right? Because if you're in a big company, there are people that are going to do a lot of that for you, right?
Yeah. Although imagine what they could get done if they could. It depends on the rule. There are often reasons why people aren't using these tools.
But most of them probably are not wanting to deploy stuff like that. I mean, some of them could just be internal web applications, right? You can never use Heroku or now.sh for internal facing websites, right? It just doesn't make any sense.
No.
And that's a problem, right? And the thing is, in big organizations, a lot of what you're building are internal only projects, right? It's very small bits of it. You could have one website which the clients use and hates the internet, but then there's 5 or 6 things behind the scenes that's actually working away to give you that view, right? And, web administration stuff might just, is all just hidden away and is all internal. At which point, if you can't run those things internally, you're never going to, they don't even make sense in those situations, right?
So I think there are some situations where the company could but doesn't want to. And I think that statement will date badly because I think a lot of the business leaders have realised there's been a big push, and I think a lot of big companies and big investment banks and big companies that I didn't think would pick this stuff up, it's quite mature now. They've had 4 or 5 years to get their act together, and they are doing it. And so I'm hearing a lot of stories of people using the cloud in bigger companies in quite controlled ways with teams looking after it. But they're getting some of the benefit. But the example you just gave, that's probably, at the moment, the technology doesn't even exist to host something, say, on a platform like Heroku, but keep it so that only your organization can see it. So maybe it's like firewalled or in a private cloud.
And that is one thing that Amazon have not always done, but have had for a long time. You can use a lot of their services in your own VPC, or what they call it, which is like your virtual private cloud. So it's your isolated infrastructure, and you can access it without going over the internet is the other thing as well.
Yeah.
So that's another potentially big problem, right? Is that if you've got, you're like, okay, we're happy with storing our data on the cloud in an encrypted form, but we don't want any of that traffic going over the internet so somebody could snoop it. You want it to only go through connectivity that you own. And with Amazon, you can do that because you can pay for direct connectivity from your data center to Amazon's.
So I think what's interesting for me is that there are the cases where people just can't do this stuff because there are legit reasons. There are cases where they could, but they won't. And to me, it kind of makes no difference because the problem I have is I don't know why, but my mentality is if I'm building a website, let's say it's an internal website for a big company, and there's George and I don't want to pick any more silly names, but there's, George really wants this thing done.
George and Paul, we could go after the Beatles.
George and Paul and Ringo want they all want this app really building, and they'll be really happy when it's done. And for me, that's why I'm here. But that doesn't change the fact that once I know these tools exist and I've seen them, it still takes me longer to build it for them than it would without them, even though it's inappropriate to use them. And so,
but what's your solution there then, right? Like it's easy to say I want to use them even though it doesn't make sense, but you can't. So
quit.
What's the difference? I mean, if you ever want to build anything internal,
which is why I changed my career around. Basically, I don't think I really realised it at the time, but that's basically what I did, was because I realised the amount of smiles, I don't know, that sounds really corny, the amount of smiles I could put on people's faces in a year was like the amount of like, I think people call this impact is the sort of term people use, but the amount of like people I can make happy and meaningful software I could build was less per unit of time. So in a year, I'd look back at that year and be like, oh, I did a couple of projects. Whereas if I'm just hacking on and I can use Heroku and I can put some stuff in Google Docs, like through an API, or there's another one called Airtable, and I can use Stripe to take payments and all these other things we're talking about. And I can use an AWS database because, whatever, that's what I needed. I can just physically, I can look back and feel like I've accomplished a lot more. In reality, it's not really true, because if you think about it like super rationally, you're like, oh, I work for, Corporation X, and they have these constraints on their business. That means we need to use a private cloud. None of those tools are therefore applicable because I can't get out to Stripe and all that stuff because that's not what they want to do, and they don't want user data leaving.
Yeah.
And so, and then you put in good work, but you still end up, I don't know how to explain it, but it's like the distance you've traveled. If you use the analogy of like in a car, that's not a good analogy. It's like how much you feel like you've built in terms of features is still less because everything's harder. It's like you're fighting against various factors, and it has to be done that way. And like I
guess it's less efficient, is what you're saying.
Yeah. The efficiency is lower. Yeah, and I basically now only choose to work in places where the efficiency is quite high.
But when was the last time you worked in a company of more than 10 people?
My first job was a really big company, 25,000. And the second job was a company of about 50.
Yeah. And then after that?
The one after that was big again.
Yeah.
And the one after that was a bit bigger, but I'm often working on smaller projects in teams.
The thing is, right there, I think a lot of the places you're working, you have the opportunity to... There's no pre-existing... The thing is, they're all new, right? So there's no pre-existing technology that you have to deal with. Yeah. So it's easy then, right? Because Greenfield's always easier than Brownfield.
Yeah, so Greenfield also...
I'm not sure I like those terms, to be clear.
Yeah, but they sound a bit weird. Greenfield, for those of you who are not familiar with these terms, Greenfield is when you start a project from scratch with no existing stuff. It's the same as when you build houses. You build a new house on a...
New bit of land.
A new bit of land, yeah, that's not new, but like you find like a field that's empty. Brownfield is where you're coding and there's already some stuff that's been built and you have to edit it, and you've got what people call a legacy, so like old code, which you've got to make sure that it still works. And that is always harder. And I don't work, in general, if I have a choice, I don't work in Brownfield stuff either, because the same metric...
it's the same. It's awful.
The same metric that I just quoted, which is like, I want to look back in it over my year and be like, how much stuff did I build that I cared about and other people cared about, is always worse than Brownfield. I don't think it means that work is less valuable to the company. It's just a fact of life, but I don't...
But it's not as enjoyable, right? No. For example, Brownfield projects are hard, like you said, and the reward is less.
I don't know what kind of people... To me, you have to be a strange kind of person to be like that. I have met a few people along the way in my career that I feel they accept that fully and they are okay with it. But for me, it's just not what motivates me. So have you met people that you think would be really happy in those sorts of things?
Well, you get what you see is people get attached to their software, right? So then it's like, well, you either need to, and then it gets to a point where your application is perhaps successful enough that you need to subsume other applications. And then it's like, well, now you've got to... There's a project there, right, which is to decommission other application X to become... Because you're going to replace it with that. Happened at my first place a lot. Yeah. Where they're trying to rationalise because they've got way too many... Because everyone always wants to do Greenfield. You end up with this problem at the end state, which you've got 1,000 applications where there's a considerable amount of overlap between some of them. So at some point somebody goes, well, we've got 3, I think at some point they had 10 risk systems or something, 10 different independent applications calculating risk. And they were like, right, we don't need 10, we need 1. Yeah. We can't get to 1, so let's try and aim for 3.
Oh, God.
With what they said. But there's some people there going, you know what, that's for me. Because they picked the 3 that they were like, these are the 3 best ones.
Yeah.
So now we need to subsume the other ones. And there's people that own those 3 have that emotional attachment to it, I assume, where they're
okay.
You know what I mean? They're like, this is our application and we want it to be good.
I was going to suggest that maybe they're just serial killers.
Yeah, well.
Or that they have something else wrong with them. They were, I don't know, just something went wrong in their life and then this was the dark path.
I don't enjoy it either, actually. I've only done it, I've done it twice where, once where I was doing that sort of thing, taking over a very similar application and subsuming it, and a separate place where they had an existing system. But in that situation, we just started again. We just had a clean break.
Yeah.
In the last 2 places, actually, just a clean break.
Yeah.
And that sort of is greenfield. You've got to do the migration.
I think that's fine, yeah. I'm not bothered if the code that I'm writing is necessarily trailblazing a new thing. That doesn't necessarily bother me that much because it will still make someone happy. I just want to see the progress of what I'm building.
But you can work in a big organisation and affect a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
Like my wife is currently... She's a UX designer, and she is redesigning the login screen, the client login screen for the investment bank she's working in. Mm-hmm. That application has 100,000 users globally.
That's ridiculous.
But it's only a login screen.
Yeah.
And it's not particularly interesting.
It's been done before.
Yeah, but she's redesigning it, and the output of her work will be that 100,000 people globally who use this investment bank for their services will see that redesigned thing. So I guess it's that, I know you use that word of impact. It's difficult to measure, and like you say, I think everyone's different. But I would say I'm not that bothered about a login screen. Whereas at that point, it's really important, and they need to look good because it makes first impressions and things like that. So as I definitely see that different people have different impact.
Yeah.
For me, I'm less bothered about whether it's a public-facing impact versus a private internal-facing impact, I guess.
Yeah.
But similarly, it's difficult for me to say. It's difficult for me to necessarily appreciate your point of view and vice versa, perhaps, because the technology I use is never going to be modernized like that. Yeah. KDB, right? It's not going to be in that situation. So. Yeah. I'm always going to be, as long as I use this technology, I'm always going to be constrained by old-fashioned, to some degree, problems, which is infrastructure-level problem. I should just say that because it's easy for me to denigrate what you're trying to say, but I'm coming at it from an angle where that isn't even an option for me. And if it was, I'd probably be on your page as well.
Yeah,
because if you say you can get a 30% efficiency gain by switching to technology X, Y, and Z, I don't know why you'd say no.
Yeah.
Right? If you're thinking it the other way around.
Yeah.
Trying to justify switching from an old technology to this new, more efficient way. I was sort of disagreeing with you initially, right, of the switch. But then if you reverse it, it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. It's weird. I'm realising as we're talking about this that this is the core thing that I wanted to talk about today. This was what was kind of not under my skin, but I've not worked anywhere for about 4 years that's not had what in my subjective mind is quite a high efficiency value. Like the technology or the cloud services or whatever the programming languages, all of those things, brownfield, greenfield, all the technology has a high efficiency and I can get quite a lot of stuff done. And the more stuff I can get done, the better in the fixed amount of time.
Yeah.
And that, I think it's funny that one of the things that's very funny I've found about my career is that I haven't really been able to pinpoint what does and doesn't motivate me. I just gather data about when I'm sort of happy and sad at work, and I have to try and reverse engineer what it is. This is one of the only ones I've figured out. I think there are other factors that I've not, even about myself, let alone what motivates you or a DBA or someone that likes working on brownfield projects. I think everyone's a bit different. But this is something. And the reason that I wanted to talk about cloud services is because of all those different levers. It's probably the biggest one. Like, I think if you said to me, oh, you can only ever use Java, I can still get stuff done. You're not turning down the efficiency that much. But if you said to me, you can no longer use Heroku and Stripe for a lot of the things I build, that's really big. That's probably like a 60, 70%. You know, it's almost unthinkable how big some of these cloud services, they let you do really complicated, like AWS is, for all its sins, you know, like building that on your own.
I agree.
And it's not even like you could build something which was a subset of it, which was just what you needed, but then it's going to go wrong and it's going to break and you're going to spend loads of time fixing it.
Yeah.
Whereas when you just use their stuff, you know it's going to work, and because they've already done it once and they've done it well. So I guess that's really like why I've kind of... And obviously the thing is that we've had this big innovation where like this 10-year period roughly. I don't know when the cloud started. I feel it's like 2005 or 6.
Well, I think 7. AWS definitely wasn't first. I feel like Rackspace is quite old.
Oh yeah. That was before, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I remember when we left university, which was 2010, my tutor at the time was talking about pushing a lot of their heavy computations onto AWS. And that was like, because they had their own server room for the duration that we were there. I don't know if they still do. I'd imagine it's got smaller. I would hope it has. Just taking up all that, all those giant fees. But I think things have changed so drastically in that time.
And I think, a really interesting point you were saying there, the reason that Amazon can offer 60 or whatever it is services is because they've got a team working on a product, finishing a product, it being great, and then they can all collectively move on to the next one. Rather than, say there's a team of 60, rather than each individual one going to 60 different organizations and starting from like, okay, let's have virtual machines. Okay, let's have virtual networking. And then all the other things, they've solved those problems and then go, you know what, now we're going to have, NoSQL databases as a service.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, that's awesome. I mean, even just the database as a service where you can pick any database technology that sends, you can even run Microsoft SQL Server in RDS. There must be, I assume there are probably a few large, high-paying organizations that want that, but still, you'd be like, well, we'll just run one. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So the fact that they've worked their way through, and then because they keep working, they just keep adding stuff, things that you would never even necessarily think that you need.
Yeah, really great. And everything, basically it's like, some companies have centralized things that everyone needs. They've done it really, really well.
Yeah.
And they've poured more time and investment than most of the users of that technology ever could have, because they just have a dedicated team of 2 or 3 that will kind of, it'll be impossible for them to build something that's as good as like RDS or EC2, which is the server one, or Heroku or whatever it is, or Stripe, Google Docs. Google Docs, it's been around for a long time. It's just a spreadsheet. Like, I'm just thinking of the spreadsheet one, which is Sheets,
yeah.
Which is, it's been around for ages and it's not changed very much at all. In fact, it's stagnated in my opinion, but it's still immense. Like, if you set out to build that,
you build an Excel replacement is what they did, right?
Yeah.
They were like, let's build a replacement, an online replacement for Excel.
Yeah,
that sounds impossible.
Yeah,
still,
and even now, even in 2019, 2020, that's a hard thing to do. So I think it's just, you get to use all this stuff, but the cost of it is that because the only monetization model that currently really is working on the internet is that you run some code that's private and closed source on a server and then charge people for that thing. That we've not really found another monetization route, really. Like I guess you've got people pay for stuff. One-off. Then you don't really
one-off, yeah.
One-off is unusual though for cloud-based stuff.
That doesn't
as a service. So subscription or advertising are the only 2 revenue generating models that work. So like Facebook have got a load of closed source stuff that other people might find difficult to replicate, although you could argue not. I think they're mainly protected by the network of all your friends are on Facebook, the network effects. And then they just, monetize you through ads. And the only other way is that you just put your credit card in. And so all of this data necessarily needs to live. Well, at the moment, we don't have the technology, but all this data lives on their servers, which is going to cause a problem for regulatory issues or some other sensitivity issues where people don't want their data residing elsewhere. That's probably the single biggest thing that blocks some of these things, and sort of security and then them not talking to each other from security. So you can use AWS, you put it behind like a VPN in a private cloud, but then you can't use something else because talking, there's no Google Docs behind a private cloud as far as I know. It's just on the open internet. So then you can't use that.
But again, they might have it now where you can route it privately.
Yeah, maybe there are these sorts of things.
The thing I wanted to say there actually was what AWS did, I think, is provide those building blocks that allowed these more complicated services to be built on top.
Yeah.
Because Heroku, right, I think my understanding anyway, might not be perfect, is Amazon's Elastic Beanstalk is the equivalent of Heroku.
I think so, yeah.
But that didn't exist for a long time until a long time after Heroku came around, right?
Using AWS.
Yeah. So what the people at Heroku have gone and done is said, well, we can programmatically spin up and spin down all of these pieces that we need to host a website on AWS. So if we just do that, and then that's a value add on top of AWS, and then we just charge for that.
Yeah.
That's then, it's a level above, and they've used those existing technologies that AWS or Azure, but AWS were definitely the first big one. It's that sort of build, it's that layering on top of technology, right? And then now SH are sort of seeing what Heroku have done and maybe doing things slightly differently or abstracting even further. I guess it's levels of abstraction.
Yeah, it's all about levels of abstraction. And as you know, and maybe the listeners don't know about me, I'm at the top level on this stuff. Mm-hmm. I don't like low level things. Jas is a little bit more low level than I am.
Yeah, I find it more interesting whether I want to work in it day in, day out.
Yeah, I think it's kind of cool to see how things work like that. But because I think I'm highly motivated by how much impact I'm having over time, I don't wake up every morning and think must have impact today. Some days, but not every day. But I think it's just I get miserable if the inverse is true. I spent all day today debugging some boring issue that shouldn't really have been a problem if we could have just used this service, which we can't for legitimate reasons. But I'm just I'm kind of I'm out. I think the amount of money someone would have to pay me to work on those problems is a lot more. I'm trying to put a number on it in my head as we're talking, but it's maybe 1.5 to 2 times. It's a lot. It's people can't afford it, kind of a lot. It's kind of why would they pay someone twice as much? It's interesting though how greenfield and brownfield work, and generally work that I think both you and I wouldn't like, is not generally paid. Sometimes it's paid more and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is. Investment banks pay more, and I think that you're getting paid a premium because you kind of have to put up with some stuff.
Yeah.
And that's presumably kind of what it is. But not really with the tech. Sometimes you could go and work for an investment bank, get paid loads of money, and they're we're going to build this green thing. I've certainly been paid quite generously in the last few years for doing things which I thought were super fun and weren't those things. Weren't brownfield, and I could use the cloud, and so I don't. Yeah, I don't really. It's a strange.
I think that probably the only thing there is that there's enough people to go around. Yeah, they don't need to worry about that as much, right? The pay doesn't need to be increased. They only need to do that if no one would work in those projects. Then
maybe there's just a lot of serial killers out there and sort of people
just love
had bad childhoods and
love just stabbing themselves with a knife
just over and over again. But
just it doesn't hurt anymore, so it's okay.
I think it just depends how you rationalise it. I can see that those people, maybe they're just
I think some people. I hope people go. The example of the risk systems one, something like that. I'm assuming people are going into that knowing this is going to be an absolutely, really, really, it's going to be an unbelievably difficult project.
Yeah.
But I think some people, those sort of people, must be getting off on the difficulty rather than, it's not even difficulty from a technical point of view, it's difficulty from just an execution point of view, right?
Yeah.
How the hell do we get this done? This is holistically from the high level, this looks impossible. We've got to bang our heads together and solve it.
Yeah, and you and I would find it a nightmare, but for them, it's people run marathons and people do all sorts of things.
And I think it's just the difficulty of it that attracts them to it, and it's that's going to be really hard. Because I don't think you'd ever be we're going to go write this new system. It's actually going to be really easy, and we'll do it in a week. You'd be well,
yeah,
I'll go do something a bit more interesting. And I guess it's just how far on that scale you are.
Yeah,
and some people might just be literally finding the most difficult projects. Because I guess maybe the thought is if you succeed, you're going to be the impact there is going to be very high, but Whereas you have high impact, your success rate is also a lot higher.
Yeah.
Whereas in those ones, I would say, you've got a 70% failure rate in a big investment bank to decommission own software, just because it's so hard.
Those projects fail all the time.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? But I assume people are going in going, this is going to be really hard, but we can do it this time.
A high attrition rate, maybe a high suicide rate, I don't know.
Yeah.
Possibly, I don't know. They probably just quit.
I think I guess if you can't do it, you just go, look, that's, we can't. But
it needs doing. It's one of those things, like it needs doing, and there is benefit to a person. It just doesn't, for me, it just doesn't feel rewarding. But one of the other things I sort of wanted to talk about in this episode was, so we've sort of talked about AWS and Heroku. We kind of talked about Google Docs. And there are a few other tools. There's more and more tools coming along. And the last year or two, especially from a startup perspective, there are a lot more tools. I think Stripe has been an absolute revelation. So
for payments, yeah.
So for those of you that don't know, Stripe's a payments gateway, I think is what they call it. And what that means is they've built a nice API where you can give the credit card number, expiry date, and CVC or whatever it's called, and it will take a payment from your customer. And then you can do things like save them and save multiple cards. And there's regulatory stuff in most countries about that.
And you don't have to worry about that.
You don't have to worry about any of that. And if you just want to put a credit card form on your website in like 5 minutes, they've got a piece of JavaScript that you can load on the page and puts a little thing. Yeah. And there were already people doing payments. And then it was a couple of young entrepreneurs came through and they made it very developer centric, because they realized the people that were putting this stuff on websites, especially at the beginning of startups that got big, were people like us. And, the business people, the fee rates, they just had to match the others. And then it's like, shall we use Stripe or shall we? I recently integrated Braintree into something, which is
which is PayPal's one.
Yeah, it got acquired by PayPal. And all I was thinking the entire time was, I really wish I was using Stripe, because it's just like the docs, everything about it as a developer, that they really get it. Their docs are like world class. They'll have like each API thing. You in the right hand side, you can then see, it will tell you a bit about it, and then there's like a box where it shows you the code for like 10 different languages. And it's like nice. It's so good. Like it's
yeah. We integrated with PayPal and another payment provider. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but yeah, they were complicated. Not complicated. Well, yeah, complicated. They're using things like XML.
Yeah,
and you've got to have like a public accessible URL for them to hit.
Oh no!
Once things have been authorized and things. So I definitely appreciate Stripe. We just couldn't use Stripe because of the business we were in.
You had like a legit regulatory reason you couldn't use it, because it was kind of a gambling related thing.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting about Stripe though is that then it's kind of where these cloud services start working together that's really interesting. So there are tools that sit on top of Stripe. So once you've got a business which is generating, say, $1,000 of revenue a month, and you want to track it, there are like apps which you can connect to your Stripe, and they'll give you like a breakdown and tell you where revenue's coming from. And there's a whole bunch of other businesses, and I will link to one of them, which I can't remember the name of. It's just all these other things you can then just plug in because they've got good APIs. It's kind of, I think some people call it the API economy. Like, I'm always looking for good APIs.
Yeah.
So Stripe's a big one. Google Sheets, there's a new kid on the block called Airtable, which is basically Google Sheets, but each column has a type.
Yeah.
So you can say, this is a date, this is text, this is a number, this is a currency.
Yeah.
So it's kind of more like a database, but it's still it's a sheet.
Table.
It's a table. And then that has really good APIs, whereas Google Sheets APIs are like OAuth, nightmare, they're rubbish. Whereas with this, it's like, you want to read all your data out of your spreadsheet, you like click a button to go to the docs, and it gives you like the line of code you need for that spreadsheet in the language you want. So it's like 2 lines of code and you've like got, it's not perfect, but it's pretty great. You can insert data. So on lots of small projects I'm working on now, I'm using this as a database, because if you're just doing something dodgy for yourself, it's basically like a database because it's a table,
and you get the visible, like non-technical people can see the table.
And so I'm hearing of a lot of startups and even bigger companies where, like, that scenario where it's like, oh, we need to build a dashboard for this, or some we need to be able to create, read, update and delete things, a CRUD app, and we just need to build this rubbish website which all it does is like show you the data.
Yeah.
Well, now they just link it to an Airtable and they say, if it's wrong, you don't change it that often, but if it's wrong, just go in there and change
just update it.
Just update it manually. It's kind of, and it's it's a bit of a revelation, really. And they're charging, I think they're being quite successful. They charge like $10 a month or something. And it's like...
Yeah, for small applications, it's perfect, right?
Yeah, for like little things. I think it's one of those things, like it won't scale.
No.
But for certain things where you know the number of rows is going to be low, or you're just trying something out, you want to prototype something, you can
rather than being like, I've got to set up a database, define the table, define my interface to, build the inserts and selects and stuff. Yeah, you could just be like, get rid of all of that. Simplify, right?
Yeah.
It's opinionated to some degree, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is how it's going to be done. And you're like, that's fine.
But it's a really useful building block. Another one is Zapier, which lets you connect cloud things to other cloud things. So you can say, when I get an email in Google Mail, everything has to be public, which is what it comes back to this private cloud, public cloud thing. Because everything's accessible, they have integrations with like Dropbox,
like Slack,
Google
right?
Drive, Slack as well is a really good example. And then you can all of this cloud stuff can then talk to Slack. And now when I pay money on my business credit card, I get a Slack. And if any of my team did, I get a Slack saying you've spent this money, or your card got declined. And it's like this is amazing.
Yeah,
it's like all these things talking to one another. But yeah, Zapier. So I met a lady who was running a business. I was talking to her about becoming a client, and she was running basically a bakery, like an online bakery. So if it's your wife's birthday and you want to buy her a nice big cake, which I'm sure she would appreciate, lactose-free cake, you can go to her and you can say, I want this kind of cake. It's a birthday. It needs to be like lactose-free.
Yeah.
And then she'll put the project up to a bunch of cake makers who will then bid on it. And then they'll come back and then she connects them. So it's kind of like a marketplace for like, you want a cake.
Okay.
But she built a prototype, which she was like doing about 100, 150 cakes a month, multiple thousands in revenue using Stripe, Zapier, like Google Docs, and a bunch of other tools. She hadn't written a line of code.
Wow.
Not written a line of code.
That's impressive.
Running this whole business, like MailChimp for the for sending out emails. It's just like, it's a different world. And it's a world that was not available to us, like even maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Some of these tools weren't there.
No, you couldn't be like, I'm going to start a bakery marketplace without knowing how to code.
Yeah.
That, I mean, particularly coming out of university, that would be impossible.
It would be absolutely impossible. And now, I couldn't believe it. I was gobsmacked. I thought I was out of a job for a second until she told me how much human effort there was into every... Because that system...
Well, that's the thing, right? Yeah.
If you built that system as a developer, it would just run and...
You wouldn't need any intervention.
It's easy peasy. She's like, killing herself because it is still quite manual. But the thing is, I think with startups...
But it's an enabler, right?
Yeah.
It enabled her to start without having to worry about how am I going to afford to pay for a piece of software.
And she probably built it quicker than even the best software engineer could have built that system. And she could tweak it. The editability of it's much higher, whereas software is quite bad.
And she knows exactly what she wants because she's the business person and she's building it, right?
Yes.
It's not that, because then you've got the problem of communicating what you want to a developer.
And if this cake idea was for the birds, then she could have, she's invested a lot less time and money.
Yeah.
And it's in general, you're almost at a disadvantage if you try and start a business as a coder because your instinct is to code everything, when probably actually the best course of action is to do what she did. And she built a whole prototype and said, there's an essay by Paul Graham where he says, do things that don't scale. And she did a lot of things that definitely didn't scale. When I met her, she looked very tired, but it worked.
MVP, right? You've always got to aim for the MVP.
Yeah.
Just about gets the job done initially, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because we made that problem at our startup. It was a difficult problem and there was no obvious route to market without the full product.
Yeah.
So then you're putting a lot of money in to get your MVP, which happens to be your whole product. Yeah. MVP meaning minimum viable product, not most valuable player.
The viable was like, so it's like, what's the minimum thing you can build that is viable so that people will hopefully want to use it.
Can use it at least.
And it's a product.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think, doing anything again, it's like, what's the minimum? It's hard as a developer to be like, we just don't need to worry about these things.
Oh, it's tough.
You've got to just be like, look, what's the absolute minimum we can do to get this out the door in a workable way? And what all of these cloud services have made that MVP do a lot more for a lot less.
Yes.
Because if you were like, our MVP, we have to accept payments, but there's no Stripe, you have to go directly to some acquiring bank or something, that's going to be months and months of effort, right? because you've got to talk to whoever your bank is to accept card payments.
You need to become like a merchant bank or something mental. Yeah,
exactly, right? Crazy. So and I imagine 15, 20 years ago, that won't be that far from the truth.
And these businesses just didn't get started because who's going to be bothered with that?
But with them, you can say, right, our MVP can accept payments and it's only going to take us an extra hour, say, for example. And then you've got a product that can accept payments. That's brilliant.
It's a really exciting. It's what a time to be alive with all these. Time. What a time! But I'm trying to think if there are any other good ones. We may need a dedicated episode for this one, but I use a thing called Firebase a lot, which is a more programmery one. It's kind of like MongoDB, so it's
like a NoSQL.
Yeah, it's a document storage database, I believe. I'm not an expert on NoSQL or SQL, and just none of the. If it has SQL in it, I'm out. But it's like a giant JSON object that you store.
It's a bit like it's almost like a what's the word? The state in a Redux application.
Yeah,
it's basically that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's just a giant JSON object, and it can store stuff, and it can handle common sign-up flow. So it has APIs for people signing up, logging in, resetting passwords, and it will send them emails when they reset their password. So like all this stuff that goes in nearly every app you build, it's kind of got covered. If you want to send notifications for apps, it's got that too. It got bought by Google, and they've kind of made it more robust, which is good. But they've also tried to suck you in and make it's very convenient. It now has analytics and all these other things, and you're kind of like, But it is you for certain applications. If you know what you're doing with it, it can cut the time that it takes to build. It basically really covers
login and storage, right?
Yeah, those are the two big ones. And there are a few other things it does as well. And the storage knows about the login, so you can secure users' data against their login just built into the database.
Yeah.
And it's super, and everything's also real time. So you can build you could build a Facebook or a Reddit clone off it really easy. I don't know, it scales to like 1 million users. So for getting things started,
it's pretty good.
1 million concurrent users, which is a lot, I think. Depending on what you're doing. So it's really powerful, and it shaves the time in half for building things. So it's just very cool, and like all these libraries as well.
So I did want to make an honourable mention to something that I know even big organisations still haven't got onto yet, but is, I think, almost a critical thing for a business to have, and that's Office 365.
Oh yeah.
So Office 365 is basically just, rather than running your own Exchange server, which any big organisation probably would, and have Word and Excel, it's all cloud-based.
Yeah.
But then because it's Microsoft, it's all built on Azure. And then the really interesting bit actually is they have focused that product a lot more on hybrid cloud deployments. So obviously Office 365 is entirely cloud-based.
Yeah. But
they have built it under the assumption that a lot of the people who are going to want to move to this already have existing private stuff. Yeah. So they have a lot of functionality to support these difficult technical problems that we were talking about, where you've got internal facing applications. So you can do things like they have a way for you to do auth through your email address and standard password, but for any internal application.
Oh, that's great.
And also for other cloud applications as well. So if any cloud application supports SAML.
Yeah, SAML, yeah.
So Slack does, and a few other things that we've done.
You can just log straight into Slack.
So it's all automated. Yeah.
That's great.
So you only have one login. It's all single sign-on.
Yeah.
So that's quite nice. And they've done that. And I think that, to be fair, for me, I just think it's really good. I know Google have the same thing as well.
Yeah.
But it's that you've got to decide, right, who's our identity owner? Which product's going to own all of our identities? Whether that's Google Apps or Office 365.
Yeah.
And then, okay, how do we spread this out? Because if you've got a company of more than, say, 10 or 15, if you're like, you've got a login for like 8 different things, which I imagine, going back to that woman that you were talking about running the bakery, having to log into each separate piece every time, you're going to be like, you just want to abstract all that away. And I like that. And I think Office, Microsoft are trying that. They've got their Slack competitor now, Microsoft Teams and things like that. It's weird how they've changed over the same period, actually.
I was going to say they've gone from strength to strength. I'm not sure they've definitely gone from strength to...
They've turned a corner.
They've turned a corner, yeah. And at the moment, it's interesting in these big companies, they seem to have hits and misses. I think Amazon and Microsoft have been the two top performers of the big companies. And Facebook has had a lot of PR problems, although is arguably still doing quite well. And Google doesn't, in my opinion, has done very little that is meaningful in the last 5 years. They released a lot of products and then they all slowly die off. And some of them are really good ideas, like Chromecast was excellent. Google Mail and Google Apps was really good, but they're kind of given it a bit of love recently. But
Inbox is a good example of that.
Yeah, they kind of integrated most of those features into Mail, though, to be fair. So maybe that was a success. But Hangouts died. Like all these things where it's kind of like they just don't really feel like they know what they're doing.
I guess that's always a risk whenever you're going to use any cloud product that we described. What happens if it goes away?
Firebase is probably the most terrifying one for me because
it's owned by Google.
Now it's owned by Google. I feel a bit better, but when it was a startup, there was a big competitor called Pars that got bought by Facebook, and then they shut it down. And if you built an app on Pars, you were properly, changing a database has got to be in the top 3 worst, hardest things to do.
Yeah.
In like brownfield development terms.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And if your database is like, oh, sorry, we're turning it off in 6 months.
And you have no way of extending that, right? Because obviously if you're running internally, you go, well, we'll just keep it running.
Yeah, unsupported, you get more time. But no,
hard deadline.
They turned it off. I mean, they gave them a warning, but it just, Firebase had won. And even now, it's like, what might happen with Firebase, and they might force you to upgrade, and you don't have control. That is the thing with the cloud. You don't have the control. And I think it's interesting though. I think it's not fundamental. I mean, this is getting more pie in the sky. I don't think there's a fundamental reason that running versions of this software, it has to be centralized like this. But that's just at the moment with the technology we have, that's the only way we can do it. So everything is centralized, and there's only you can't run an old Pars instance. I think they did open source it actually.
So the only person who ever really embraced that from the start was GitHub, right?
Yeah.
They had their very expensive enterprise.
What a cloud service that we missed for programmers. And that's been massive. And now GitLab, and then the dreaded Bitbucket, which I'm not a fan of.
No, but as in, I actually think those things are probably a separate discussion.
Yeah.
But yes, I agree. It is a game changer. But I think there's a lot to talk about in those. But they from reasonably early on had a on-prem version.
Yeah.
Now I think that's maybe because they were around before cloud was really a thing. Like they were sort of just before AWS and those sort of things. Yeah. So they must have been like, well, you either use ours, but everyone's like, no way, because they were one of the first sort of cloud products that everybody wanted to use. Yeah. So then they were like, well, we have to offer this as a...
It's interesting, yeah.
Whereas people like... So Slack were thinking about doing that.
They backed out.
And they haven't.
I think you're right. I think the timing was important. I think if Slack had been invented 2 years before it was, and there's no reason technically that Slack could not have been invented. It could have been. Yeah. It's not technically that innovative. But yeah, no, they would. I'd imagine there was a tremendous amount of pressure on them to do on-premises deployments of Slack. I mean, Slack's so ubiquitous now, we haven't even had to explain what it is, because it's like, who has not seen it? It's a chat app, which is very good. Mainly, except on mobile, but yeah, they're
and the new logo.
I haven't seen the new logo.
Oh,
I quite like the old one.
Yeah, it's gone.
Is it gone?
Yeah, that's a separate
discussion.
Your app will probably update on you.
Oh, I'll have to look later on. That would be a follow up.
Slack's weird though, right? Because I think I still think that they're going to harm their adoption by not. So I think Slack's one of the ones that I think you still need to, because I think a lot, anyone that's regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority or someone like, a financial regulator is going to need to have, I would imagine, that sort of level of, they're going to want to have the data on their data centers. They want to be able to have access to it at all times.
Yeah.
Even though they can add all the features,
They have added all the features. So there's a feature where you can download all the chats as a giant JSON file. Yeah. That's like their solution. All the chats ever.
Which Office 365 does the same thing. Like if you're like, I need to download the inbox of some person, you can do that. But I feel like I was surprised that they decided not to. But maybe they've sensed that big enough companies are thinking about moving. Yeah, I'm just surprised that Slack. But yeah, you're right. It's another, imagine, think about when we left university, actually, if we wanted to talk in a group, it was Hangouts, right? But
yeah, but now, Slack's a completely different ball game.
Yeah, channels.
Yeah, Discord as well. There's all these tools for business and just leisure that are just
But I think it has. I mean, I think it's easy to forget where we were.
Yeah.
I think you said it right at the beginning, and I think that was what was really interesting.
Yeah.
Think back to where we were 10 years ago, which, depending on who's listening to this podcast, some people might only have been in the game 2 or 3 years and they've just had this stuff the whole time. But for us, as old people, relatively, 10 years ago, a lot of the things we've described would be very hard if you had nothing.
Yeah,
to start from scratch.
I now regularly build things in 3 months, which I think would have more or less I would never have even attempted before this wave of technology, because it's just the amount it enables you. I think we've not even really scratched the surface of like programmer specific tools. We've discussed a few like Firebase, GitHub is.
I think it's probably again, it's a topic a bit like the testing one. It's so big that we're really just sort of summarizing things that we think are of interest generally. But I think you could have a deeper discussion on, you want to build a website, these are the 6 things you're going to use and why.
I think I've covered most of mine. I've at least given an honourable mention to. But yeah, it's a difficult. I mean, it is a great time to be developing. But it's just, I find it strange for myself where I'm just sort of this massive hypocrite that acknowledges that doing brownfield work is logically valuable because someone wants it and it needs to be done. I just have absolutely no interest in actually being the person that does it. It's strange.
I would agree with you. I think it's not something that's particularly enjoyable. Oh, it's maybe it takes so long to reach the point where you feel like you've achieved something that it's that reward is too far away.
Yeah. And
not guaranteed, particularly.
That's how it feels for me. Yeah, it's kind of like I'll almost forget. Yeah, you have like I have a short attention span, and if I'm working on something for 9 months and then you deliver it, I'm like, ugh.
But there's also a lot of choice, right? That's the other thing.
Yeah.
You have there are a lot of opportunities to pick what you want to do. Yeah, so then
we're spoiled, aren't we, really?
But that might change, and then you'd be like, well, I have to go do this brownfield thing now.
I've wondered about that. Or when I can only do JavaScript and no one wants to hire me.
There'll always be legacy JavaScript.
Thank God.
It's what Java was like 20 years ago, right?
All that crap code we're writing now, I'll be brownfielding that.
Yeah, well, that's where Java is now, right? So 20 years ago, it was all the rage. Everyone was doing it, and now it's dying out to some degree. I think
it's still kind of going, but yeah. But yeah, it is interesting. But yeah, I think that's it really. We have discussed the cloud almost back to front. I feel done a pretty good job. And
as well, I think we've interspersed some other interesting observations there as well. I think it's not necessarily specific about development, but I think for me it was just appreciating the cloud.
Yeah.
And what it is. Obviously a buzzword, and we hate the buzzword, but star as a service.
I think that's it from me, really.
Yeah. Let's eat.